Okay, so here we go with the next major topic in traditional Chinese medicine. It's called five-element theory or five-phase theory. I'll talk about that name difference in a few minutes. I'm taking a little bit different strategy with this topic. First of all, this little very brief lecture, 8 or 10 slides, is going to be based on The Web That Has No Weaver. I'm not going to lecture on Between Heaven and Earth as I typically do. We're going to do the five-phase personality assessment, and that'll sort of cover the Between Heaven and Earth piece for this topic. And then the rest of the remaining 2 lectures in this little mini-series are things that are a synthesis of Between Heaven and Earth, between the Web That Has No Weaver, and the Maria Mercati book, Handbook of Chinese Massage. So it's sort of a synthesis and also just my own personal knowledge and explanation of how these things work. I don't think that either of the 2 optional textbooks or the handout books do a great job of it, and Mercati's fine as far as it goes. I just don't think it's enough. So we're gonna do it a little differently this time around. So five-element theory is very central to traditional Chinese medicine. It does not replace yin and yang theory. It sort of is another layer on top of yin and yang theory. Some people treat it as something very separate and use it as a diagnostic strategy in and of itself. Some people think it's garbage and don't use it at all. Some people try to merge yin and yang theory with five-element theory. That would probably be my strategy. I think that the 2 theories together sort of add a layer to the way that you can assess your clients. So Between Heaven and Earth takes this, in my estimation, sort of unnecessarily complex psychological approach to five-element theory, and they really try to fit it into this Western psychology, almost Western mythology kind of paradigm. They talk about archetypes and psychological archetypes, and you can read about that. And it's not that it's not interesting. I just don't think it's really Chinese. I think it's a Western interpretation of Chinese medicine. So we're going to sort of just do our personality assessment, do the personality assessment exercise and presentation, which is really fun, and use that as the summary for Between Heaven and Earth. On the other hand, Web That Has No Weaver takes a really minimalist approach. Ted Kaptchuk clearly does not think that five-element theory has any great value as a diagnostic or treatment tool. So my goal is to go somewhere in the middle. Okay, so you'll find that reading in the appendix, five-element theory does not even rate its own chapter or its own section in a chapter. It's relegated to the appendix of The Web That Has No Weaver. And there are some challenges to its history, or to its value as a medical theory. Definitely take a look at pages 440 and 441 to get a little more information about that. I think probably the biggest challenge to it is that it's not a Taoist theory. It is not as ancient as yin and yang theory, and it's not Taoist. And in fact, it was actually originally used as a political theory to look at the characteristics of the seasons and the changes of the seasons to determine when, I can't remember the specific examples, but things like to determine when people who had been elected to office should be inaugurated into their office, and when there should be seasonal festivals, and when different events should be held in a community. So it really wasn't medical at all, and certainly not Taoist. On the other hand, it really does emphasize the cyclical nature of the world around us and the universe around us. So in that sense, while it's not Taoist per se, it's not competing with Taoism either. So another challenge for five-element theory or five-phase theory is that it's not really all that old. If yin and yang theory has been around for thousands of years, five-phase theory has been around for maybe 1,500 years or so. Yeah, about 1,500 years, 1,600 years. It wasn't documented until the 4th century before Christ, BC or BCE. And it wasn't really even used as a medical theory until like another 1,000 years, 1,300, 1,400 years later, only about 1,000 years ago from us. So that, in the scheme of traditional Chinese medicine, is a really young theory. And I think that's another reason that not everybody accepts it as a valuable medical theory. So the naming, 5-element or 5 phases. So Kapchuk talks about, on page 437, talks about the Chinese term for 5-element theory is Wu Xing, where Wu is the number 5 and Xing means to walk or to move. So the name Wu Xing sort of implies transition or process, or phase, as Kapchuk likes to call it. On the other hand, it's really common to hear it called 5-element theory, and I think that probably comes out of the notion of other medical paradigms that talk about elements. Greek, historically ancient Greek medicine talked about, I guess it was earth, earth, air, fire, and water, and ether. So that idea of element shows up in other medical paradigms. So although I try to call it 5-phase just for consistency with Kapchuk, I did learn it as 5-element. So 5-element theory is not so much about the physical notion of what each element is, wood or water or fire. It's not really so much about the physical element or the physical characteristics of that element in really specific ways, but in sort of general ways, as well as related functions and related characteristics. So each phase is sort of like, Kapchuk uses the word an emblem, or you could also think of it as an umbrella, sort of an overarching idea that sort of encapsulates certain ideas about how the body works and how illness works. Jumping ahead a little bit to page 441, Kapchuk describes 5-phase theory as a crucial emblem system. It's a logical, internally logical system, which is used to discuss and represent clinical phenomena. So used to discuss the balance and harmony or lack thereof of the body. Page 443, the 5 phases are often used to describe clinical processes and relationships. Again, it's that dialectical thinking. It's yin and yang-ish in that it talks about relationships. And 5-element is also used as a way to describe or conceptualize certain treatments or proper treatments. I think the last little bit here is really important. It's an explanatory theory. It explains things. It explains relationships. It explains transitions and changes. It explains the nature of change. And it's not meant to be a strict rule about how things work. As flexible as yin and yang can be, it's also kind of binding. It gives out rules for the way things work. 5 phases make suggestions about how things work, but it's not, as Kapchuk calls it, a binding doctrine. All right, so that's it for this one little lecture, just a few slides. So move on to 5-element theory lecture 2 on YouTube next.